an operations team have to bond together and start using Azure DevOps for SQL deployments. Now, before we get started, a little bit more of a promotion about Data Weekend there, even though Demir stole my thunder a little bit. Like he said, it's this Saturday, it's completely free, speakers from all around the world. I have to put about Sanders talking about tSQLt there because he's co-presenting with me this evening. Obviously, we have got a lot of other speakers from around the world as well. So, for example, we've got both a mother and a daughter presenting at separate times from New Zealand. Dean is actually speaking as well on Saturday. We also have other speakers, new speakers and well-known speakers like Glenn Berry and Kendra Little. So it's worth having a look because there really is pretty much something for everybody who's interested in the Microsoft Data Platform. We even have a session at the start of the day about quantum computing. That's how much variety there is. So it is worth looking at, obviously, after the user group this evening. Over to you, Sander.
Yeah, so for the next 90 minutes or so, we'll be talking about Azure DevOps, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle. This is from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we'll be both discussing the cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including source control, the boards, pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And in a new addition into this session, we'll also look at GitHub workflows as well.
So at the end of this session, you'll have a basic understanding of the main features of Azure DevOps and how it can be used with SQL Server. Now, in this session, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. Our manager has decided that both teams will merge into one DevOps team, so that we're all one big happy family.
In reality, though, this should be a real gradual process. However, we only have 90 minutes to go, so we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will become the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means they must speak to stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing those items, even though they may get input about those priorities from various stakeholders.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments if they appear.
Well, before we go any further, Sander, let's introduce ourselves.
Do that, shall we? So I'm Sander. I'm a SQL Server DBA living in the Netherlands. I work for Waypoint Analytical, which is a company based in the United States who do large-scale water, soil, and plant sampling analysis. I'm a Cloud and Data Center MVP, and I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. If you want to follow me on Twitter, there's my Twitter handle. I have a blog, which I try to write as much as I can. Other projects come in the way. If you have any questions after this session, drop me an email. I will try to reply as fast as I can. I love questions, so if you have any, don't be shy to ask any. All the demos you'll see today will be available on my GitHub page. Go to my GitHub page, go to the presentations, find this session, and you will see the demos right there. And now we'll go to Kevin's bio, who is slightly more complicated than mine.
Well, thanks for that, Sander. On that note, my name is Kevin Chant. I'm a senior database architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you might realize from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realise why Sander thinks this is complicated. I have over 23 years experience working in IT, and over that time I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil and health insurance industries. In fact, I've worked for companies that are in the supported companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. I've worked with all versions of SQL Server in one form or another, and I have various certifications, including both the new and the old style MCSE, and more recently I became a Microsoft certified DevOps engineer expert. Plus, as you can also see on my bio, I've recently become a Microsoft certified trainer as well. Now, I'm also on Twitter, as you can see at the bottom of my bio. My LinkedIn has got a user-friendly URL of Kevin-Chant. I have my own blog, and my email address is available upon request. And as you can probably tell from the massive fan logo there, like Demir, I'm also one of the organisers of the Data Weekender conference. Anyway, now that's out of the way, the first thing to discuss is whether to use Azure DevOps Cloud Services or Azure DevOps Server. For those who aren't aware of the difference, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application you install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. However, it's now been rebranded to look and feel just like the cloud-based Azure DevOps Cloud Services. Personally, Sander, I like to use Azure DevOps Server so that we can handle its security better on premises. Plus, it means we get to keep the back-end SQL Server databases for Azure DevOps on premises, and we get to be able to do some reporting capabilities, which just aren't available in the Azure DevOps Cloud Service. However, the downside is we have to build one or more servers with Azure DevOps Server installed for business continuity reasons. Plus, we'd have to wait a while to be able to install new features because of the cloud-first strategy. In addition, we'd have to maintain and patch those servers as well.
But if you use Azure DevOps in the cloud instead, you wouldn't have to patch and maintain those servers because it's all done in the background by Microsoft for you. Plus, it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace.
That's true, and we can still secure it in Azure anyway. Besides, whichever we use, we must consider security and compliance to keep our auditors happy. Luckily, Azure DevOps is well structured and easy to manage.
So the main point we want you to take away from this section is how that if you install Azure DevOps Server, you have to patch and maintain everything yourself, whereas the cloud-based service, it's all done in the background for you.
So, on that note, I just want to introduce you now to Azure DevOps Cloud Services. So, as you can see here, Azure DevOps has its own hierarchy. At the top, you have a logo which represents your actual Azure DevOps account, which has access to one or more organizations, which you can see on the left-hand side here. Now, these organizations can actually be the company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, it can be just a division of it. Or, like as you can see here, it can be just an organization that you've created yourself to test things in Azure DevOps. Now, if you have the right permissions, you can change various things for the organization in the organization settings section. For example, in the overview section, you can actually change the name of your organization if you really want to. However, bear in mind that if you go to change this after you've already started working with projects and creating things like pipelines and repositories, this can have effects on anything that uses them. In addition, you can have an overview of which projects you actually have installed in your organization as well. You can also look at things in the general section like users, billing, auditing, which you would think would be the auditing for everything, but it's just a rough overview of your login activity. If you want a complete overview of what's been happening, you actually have to look at your usage section here, which, as you can see, is a lot more involved. Now you can also look and see which extensions you've got installed for your organization, which we will talk about briefly later in today's session. You can even tie it in with Azure Active Directory as well, if you've got one in place. Now, there are some security policies you can change, as well as some permissions that you can apply for your entire organization here. So, for example, if I click on this screen, you can see there's some permissions I can change which will affect the entire organization. In the board section, you can view which process your various projects use. And this can be fairly important if you have projects that use different processes such as Agile and Scrum. In the repository section, there's a couple of settings you can change. The most significant one here, which I'm sure Sander will agree with, is that you can change your default branch name now for new repositories. As some of you may be aware, there is a little bit of controversy at the moment surrounding the origin of the master branch used within Git. With this in mind, Microsoft are now putting settings in place for you to be able to change the name of your default branch. So instead of being master, you can have them as something else. So when you create a new repository now, you can actually have the main branch called something else. And in fact, GitHub have also done a similar thing recently as well. If you create a new repository in GitHub now, you will notice that the main branch is actually called main. In addition to that, there's also some various pipeline settings you can change. Things to do with agent pools, and we will discuss agents later on in the session. Some general settings you can change as well. Also some settings for deployment pools if you're using them, and some other settings. And finally, you can view how much storage all your different artifacts are using throughout your entire organization. That's fairly involved, I understand. So if we go back to the main Azure DevOps home screen here, you can see that each organization can have one or more projects as well. And each project can have one or more teams, which we'll cover shortly. So if I click into one of the projects, and I just happen to have one here, especially for this evening's user group, you will see all the services that Sander was talking about earlier on the left-hand side here. So Azure boards, repos, pipelines, test plans, and artifacts. And these come as default if you create a new project from scratch. However, you can tailor it so you only have certain services available within your project, which you can view if you actually click on project settings. And again, you can only change things here if you have the relevant permissions. So there are some very useful things you can change in project settings. For the start, you can manage your teams. So basically which teams are able to in your project. And from here, as you can see, I can manage team members. So if I click on the default team, I can add and remove members from here. Now, in addition to just adding people to teams, I can actually fine-tune permissions for those teams as well. And in fact, you can also create other logical groups as well, which you can put within your teams, so that very different people within your team can do different things as part of separation of duties, if you need to work that way. So if I scroll down, for example, and select our team again, you can see there's various permissions I can change at a project level. So earlier I showed you how you can change setting permissions at an organization level. These will just change various permissions within the actual project. Now there's some other interesting things you can do in project settings here. For example, you can create service hooks in the third-party applications. So for example, if I click on create subscription, you can see I can connect up to a variety of different services, including Jenkins and Microsoft Teams, which are both very popular ones to connect to. There's various board settings you can change as well. So in the project configuration, you can just manage your iterations and your areas, which will help you with your sprint configuration. If you want to manage the bigger picture version for each of the individual teams, you would actually click on team configuration instead. And here you can manage a few extra things as well, like which items they can actually view, what their actual working days are, and working with bugs, which is a very popular option to change within Azure DevOps. So again, you can work with your iterations, which if you're working with Scrum, you would actually use as sprints, and your areas, as well as manage templates. And templates are basically predefined fields that you can have created as default. So for example, if you were to create a new backlog item, you could actually by default have text in the details section if you really wanted to. Now, as you can see there, you can also manage various GitHub connections within a project. And we actually have one in place to connect that to a GitHub project as well, which we'll show you a bit more later on. You can also change things to do with Azure Pipelines as well. So again, you can manage servers in your agent pools. Parallel job settings, which are really important, again, if you're deploying to a very large number of SQL Server instances, and other various pipeline-related settings as well. By clicking repositories here, you get an overview of all your repositories within your project. If I click on settings, again, you can do this at the organization, but if you don't have permission and you still want to change the default name of your branches, you can do it at project level instead if you want to. You can fine-tune some policies as well. Some of these are quite interesting ones to change. I've never known anybody that's Sander who would actually turn on case enforcement. It's there if you really want to do it. However, just be aware that you may get 1 or 2 issues. And you can actually change the permissions for who can do what for each of your repositories as well, which helps you realize that if you work in a project with multiple teams, you can still manage who has access to what and who can do what with your repositories. Again, you can view the storage information, but only for the particular project, whereas with the organization, when you had an organizational overview of the size of the artifact feeds. And then finally, you can change the retention settings of your test cases.
Now you're talking. So remember, there are other things we can configure as well if we dive into if we dive deeper into these settings. And the main point we want you to take away from this section is how Azure DevOps is structured. Anyway, now we've covered the main admin stuff. Let's cover version control options within Azure DevOps, which is a feature called Azure Repos.
Oh, you mean like SourceSafe?
Maybe something a little bit more modern, since Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems like DFVC and Git.
Okay. But that would only be for your development work though, right, Sander? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Well, actually, I think you'll see that when ops starts using version control, they will start to perform better. At the company where I work at the moment, we've put all our scripting and all our processes in source control. And that really made it easy to collaborate with other parts of the team and throughout the entire IT department.
Well, I'm always going for performing better, Sander, so please tell me more.
Well, like I said, Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems because we want to use a distributed version control system. Git will be the best choice for us.
Okay, what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Well, there are various things we can use for that. For example, there is the Git Flow and the Git Hub Flow.
Well, what's the difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
They are pretty similar. So the major difference between the two is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch unless it's a hotfix. So there's always some kind of development branch in between. With the GitHub workflow, there is no development branch. There are only feature branches and the main branch. And each feature gets merged into the main branch when it's right that time and it's tested correctly. It gets merged into the main branch right away. And us devs have been using source control for many years. So if we do something like pair programming between dev and ops, team members can actually get used to it.
Pair programming?
No, pair programming. This is where literally two people sit next to each other and work on the same code. I know that nowadays with the COVID-19 situation, that it's going to be a bit of a problem to sit close to each other. It usually takes to do. However, it means you end up with more stable code and you learn new coding practices better.
Wouldn't that mean there's a lot of overhead involved with that practice?
Yeah, you would think that, and you would also be correct. There's about a 15% overhead involved. But that overhead is largely compensated with the increased quality of code, which means less bug fixes. And we all know bug fixes take the most time because we have to fix the bug and do rollbacks and all those kind of things. Of course, there are other methods you can use, like code reviews. And in the end of the day, we have to see what works for our organization best and experiment what would actually work.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
So I'm glad you asked that, because in Azure DevOps, we have something called branching policies you can use. One of which is that two people have to approve the updates to the main branch.
Well, that sounds good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. So if I look back at Azure DevOps again now then, and I go to Azure repos and select branches, what I can actually do is select the ellipsis here and select branch policies. Now, if you have to be SOX compliant, for example, you need to have the 4i principle in place, which means that two people have to approve the code, to approve the pull request, for example. In order to do this in Azure DevOps, you have to make sure you set the minimum number of reviews to be at least 2. And there's various other settings you can put in place as well. Now, as part of the 4i principle, you can actually set it so somebody can vote for their own code, which is perfectly fine as long as somebody else votes for it as well. In addition to this, you will actually have to automatically include reviewers as well. So basically, people will automatically get an email when a pull request has been made. And you would do this simply by clicking on the plus sign. And as you can see here, I can add Sander to be an automatic reviewer.
These are the main points we want you to take away from this section. Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems. However, if you have the choice, Git has become the factor standard, so just use Git. In addition, you can secure updates using branching policies, like Kevin just demonstrated. And Git also hooks in really nicely with various Microsoft tools and other tools out there that really support Git, like Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio.
To that as well, it actually really works nicely now with Azure Data Studio, the full stable release. Up until recently, you could only work with database projects in the Azure Data Studio Insiders build, which is basically the build that the development team used to preview new features. However, to coincide with Ignite recently, they actually made it available in the latest release of the stable version of Azure Data Studio. So if I now click on Explore, I can show you here how database projects actually look in Azure Data Studio, which is actually quite an exciting update from my perspective. I quite like this. So if you've worked with it in the past in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, you now have yet another option. And there's various things you can do if you work with database projects in Azure Data Studio. You can basically build a project which will create a DAT pack file for you. You can also do publish, so basically you can actually make changes to your project just like you can in Visual Studio and push it to a database. And you can do a schema compare as well, so you can compare your database project to an existing database. Now, something to look out for if you are going to start using database projects in Azure Data Studio, well, there's two things really. First of all, you need to make sure you install the SQL Database Projects extension within Azure Data Studio in order for this to work. In addition to this, if you import a database from Azure SQL Database, for example, and you want to create DAT packs, I do highly recommend that you look to change the DSP line here in your SQL proj file, because as I've noticed by default, it tends to default, I should say, to SQL Server 2016 databases. So you may need to change this before you select build to create a DAT pack. So there's a couple of things to watch out for there. And of course, because Azure Data Studio comes with an extension to use Git as well, you can actually use this with Azure DevOps or any other Git repositories as well. So before we start talking about Azure boards, has anybody got any questions so far? Nope. Okay. Well, if there are any questions, feel free to put it in the chat as well.
Yes, there is nothing in the chat, so nobody's speaking. So I suppose there are no questions. So just continue. Thank you.
That's fine. So anyway, Sander, we better discuss Azure Board since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items. Now, Azure Boards can use basic, agile, Scrum, or CMMI templates for each project you create in Azure DevOps. Out of curiosity, does anybody who's watching at the moment actually work with CMMI? Because every time I ask this question, I get no responses, and it seems like the trend is continuing, Sander.
That's a good thing.
It is a little bit more involved than everything else. So anyway, as I mentioned earlier, these templates are actually called a process within Azure DevOps, which is why that process section in the organization settings is important. Because we're using Scrum, Sander, we'll probably want to use the Scrum process. For now, we can keep it as standard, but we can customize these processes if we need to. Now, I want to go through at the moment the default features you get if you're using Azure boards within Azure DevOps. So, for example, you have work items, which is where you can view all your work items for your project in a linear format. As you can see here, I actually tend to use work items to look at removed items. So it's very useful if you think somebody may have accidentally removed a backlog item. However, if I clear this tag, you will see it does involve absolutely every single item, including your test plans. Now, if any of you here in the audience this evening works with Kanban or Scrumban, this board might look familiar for you. Basically, the board section allows you to work in a Kanban or Scrumban kind of way. like you can in other board-based applications, which are fairly popular. And just like those other applications, you can customize various settings as well. Some of the more interesting customizations is that you can actually change the tag colors. So basically what you can do is change the color of your items on your boards based on what tags they have. And other popular requests as well, of course, include changing columns and swim lanes as well. Now, moving on from there, you have backlogs. And these are probably familiar to any of you that work with Scrum. And this is basically where you can view all of your outstanding work, again in a linear style format, but based at particular item levels. So for example, here, you can view all your outstanding backlog items. And notice this, like I said, is only for your outstanding work. Anything that's done will not be shown here unless you set it to be done so in the settings option, which is this cog here. Now, moving forward, if you're working with Scrum, you're probably working with sprints. And Azure DevOps has a really, really good sprint board that you can use. And as you can see here, it's quite good. And you can actually add tasks to your existing backlog items here if you really want to. And as you can see, you've actually got some tasks that are in progress and then a to-do section, which should actually be in the done state. And these are fairly easy to manage by just dragging and dropping. Now, also here in the sprint board, there's some other good pieces of functionality. For example, you can set the capacity for all your team members during the sprint, and you can do this on a per sprint basis, and it's really useful. You can also view your analytics here. So for example, here's a burn down chart. So basically, the more of your tasks for your backlog items that you complete during the sprint, the more of them you set to be done, obviously the lower your burn down should go. And also you can add an extension to add a sprint goal as well. And I've been a bit naughty here because I forgot to put the sprint goal in place to deliver this evening's session. And then there is queries, which we'll discuss in a minute.
So how are the backlog items organized for Scrum?
Well, if you're working with Scrum, the backlog items, as you can see here, is a hierarchy of epics. Each epic can have one or more features, and each feature can have one or more backlog items. And each of these backlog items, when you work on a sprint, tend to have one or more tasks. If you are going to use Agile instead, the hierarchy of work will actually be epics, features, but then instead of product backlog items, you would actually have user stories here instead.
Great. So how do we propose we use the boards? I mean, if you just have all the backlog items in one long list, it's going to be pretty cluttered, right?
Yeah, this is true. And that's why I propose we start giving backlog items sensible tags that we can filter on.
So how will we know when an item is ready to go into a sprint?
Well, we could tag the items as being refined once it's met all the criteria, as you can see here. Then after it's refined, we could potentially allocate it straight away to a sprint, which you'll be able to view in the sprint board. Another option is that we can simply just set the backlog item to be in the approved state. So if anybody's wondering how you can do these two things, you can just open up a backlog item. To add a tag, you can just click on a tag here. If you want to change it to be in the approved state, just click on the down arrow and you can set it here. So we've got a couple of options there, Sander. By the way, everybody, the standard criteria for an item to be classed as refined in Scrum is that the item is clear and small enough to be ready to be part of a sprint. However, businesses can have their own criteria for when an item is refined and ready for a sprint as well. So just bear that in mind.
That sounds good. But hang on a minute though. I've seen that we have various filters to filter on the backlog board, but you can't show items that don't have a certain tag. How will we know which items are left to be refined?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I see what you mean here. So basically, if you go to the filter and select on tags, there's an all check option and an and check option. However, there is not a not check option here. So again, Sander, we have a couple of options. Either we can move the item straight away to a future sprint once it's been refined, which we'd have to make sure we don't forget to allocate it to a future sprint every time, which of course can be quite a lot of administration work. Or we can create beautiful queries instead to show any backlog items that do not have the refined tag. Of course, they're not called beautiful queries, it's just a nickname for them. So if I click on the query section here, you can see, Sander, I've already got a query in place that will show backlog items which haven't got the refined tag on there. And it really is easy. And in fact, if you have an extension called WYCL editor installed, so if you click on editor, Sander, you can see here there's a GUI which probably looks very familiar to you and to anybody else for that matter that's worked with database designers over the years. In addition to using this GUI way as well, you can actually install an extension called a WYCL editor. And that allows you to actually work with the code behind the scenes for these queries. Now, personally, I actually really like using this WYCL editor because it gives you a lot more flexibility than the GUI designer. So it's something to bear in mind if you are looking to use queries with Azure boards. Oh, by the way, Sander, on a side note, I know that some English guy living abroad actually did put a request into Microsoft for a not option to be added here. However, because it wasn't very popular with other members of the DevOps community, Microsoft decided not to go through with it, which I can fully understand.
I wonder who that could be. Anyway, talking about sprints, how do you propose we align our Kanban method to our backlog item? I mean, our items usually only last a couple of days.
Well, if they only last a couple of days, Sander, they can potentially be converted to a backlog item, can't they?
Fair enough. But how are we going to know what our sprint goal is, though?
Well, like I mentioned earlier when I showed the sprint board, you can actually install an extension from the marketplace to create one. And then once you've done that, you can just add in here, for example, deliver, put in your sprint go there, and it's that easy. If you're wondering how to install an extension in Azure DevOps, it's fairly easy enough to do. You can just click on the shopping bag item here, and that'll take you straight to the marketplace. So I can actually do this now. So let me open it in a new tab so we don't have to keep going backwards and forwards. And then you can search for your extension here. So if we want to install the Sprint Go extension, just type in Go, click on search, and there you go. So I hope that's answered your question for you, Sander.
Yeah. So I'm guessing we're still going to use our other application to manage the boards in the meantime, before we get a good look at this?
Well, you can still use your other applications to manage boards for a while whilst you get used to Azure DevOps. However, personally, I recommend ripping the Band-Aid off and doing the migration as soon as possible, though, to take advantage of all the integration functionality you get in Azure DevOps. Of course, I only actually recommend this if you are going to go all in with Azure DevOps. If your company's decided they want to keep using the different applications, then obviously carry on using them. By the way, Sander, did I mention all the analytics and preview features we can potentially use with Azure boards?
Hold on, we only have 90 minutes.
Good point. Anyway, the main thing we want to take you to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you're a product owner.
So let's talk about Azure Pipelines, which is where we're going to build and deploy our deliverables.
We have something in the chat. Sorry, guys.
Okay, go ahead.
But actually, it's an article.
Okay.
Long. Okay, let me have a look here. Let me fight a guest user stakeholder.
Oh, it's a question. Okay. Sorry. Continue, Kevin. Fine. Sorry.
I'm just reading it now. If you've read it already, then feel free to ask it. So, if you invite a guest user stakeholder in Azure DevOps, he's able to see all the users and guest users, and this is a breach of GDPR. Indeed. So, how do you mitigate this? Well, I suspect, and obviously, if they are an external guest, you would actually have to fine-tune the permissions within Azure DevOps itself in the project settings I showed earlier, so that they can actually view the items. You can actually give them reader access where they can only literally read the contents of your boards. So I suggest if you go and look and fine-tune the permissions, that's your best route to go down. I hope that answers the question for you to a degree. Yeah. Because of the user picker functionality. Well, it is an interesting situation, I have to admit. Is there any chance I can have a think about it and get back to you by any chance? Because where I tend to work in the organizations I tend to support, they trust the stakeholders. It's obviously they're not external stakeholders from other companies that are accessing them. It tends to be large organizations. Oh, another, if that's okay, because I need to have a think about it. Yeah, sorry, Dan, is like I said, a lot of the organizations I tend to work with, all their stakeholders tend to be within the actual enterprise, so they all have trust in them. So it's an interesting situation. Like I said, I suspect you have to fine-tune the permissions, but I would have to look and check for you. I think the best thing to do, if it's okay with you, Dan, is that I'll have a think about it and pass on the answer to Damir. You'll be able to pass it on to you afterwards, if that's okay. Because as you can obviously guess, I do speak to Damir quite a lot. So, anyway, so Damir, if that's okay with you, I'm going to pass on the answer to you once I've had a chance to look into it further, if that's okay. And you can remind me of this later in the week.
Yes, thank you.
That's okay. Like I said, I don't mind helping people out, and it's an interesting situation, I have to admit. And it's when I have to admit I've not been asked before on that front. So, anyway, Sander, you were going to talk about Azure Pipelines, I do believe.
Yeah. So Azure Pipelines is where we will build and deploy our deliverables using Azure DevOps.
So how would this work with SQL Server?
Well, we could look to deploy using state-based or migration-based deployments.
Okay, so what's the main difference between those two?
Well, state-based is when you deploy the entire project to a server. So you create an artifact and you deploy it in its entire state. So that project is the state of your database. Whereas migration-based, you script out the changes and you start at a certain point and you get a new script every single time that you make when you do a deployment. And migration-based can be good, But if there's a problem, we'd have to redeploy all over from the start again. So I think in our situation, state-based would be better for us. And it's fairly easy to do a build, to build such a project from scratch with SQL Server. I will demonstrate right now. Oh, let me see if I can screen. Now I have 3 screens instead of 2. You can see my screen, right?
Yes, it's black.
Black.
Yeah.
Let me check.
You are sharing a complete. Are you showing the entire screen or just an application by any chance? Because you need to share your entire screen.
Check again. Share entire screen number 3.
This is what happens, Sander, when you decide to add an extra monitor in between doing presentations.
Yeah, that's just happening. You don't see the window
It's
right
still
now?
black.
Okay, so I'm going to change the setup. Let me check. It's going to be okay. Teams just doesn't handle the fact that I have multiple screens.
Yes, it does actually. You can choose the whole screen.
That's what I suggested.
Now we see some browser, Firefox.
You see it now, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So when I first started to do all these database projects, by the way, this is.
Can you zoom in a bit, Sander?
Oh yeah, I'm going to zoom in. So this is Windows Terminal, by the way. You can create different profiles. So I will other. Demo. So clean up. There we go. So when I first started to do all these database projects, it was becoming tedious very fast because I had to open Visual Studio, create a project, import all the stuff from that database, all the objects from the database, then create another project within the solution to separate the data model from the results. So what I did was I created a template using the PS module development PowerShell module. And what this does is it creates, I created a template, and by that, because I can templaterize the entire architecture, the entire directory structure, I'm able to create a project or a solution within seconds. So I'm going to demonstrate that, show you how the scripts look like. So I'll open it for you. Go. In a bit. So this is the entire script. And the most important part of this script is the invoke psmd template. And what this entire script will do, this is a project that is on my GitHub page. It's called SSDT with tSQLt template. It will download that for you and install it. And then if I run that little script, it will create that project for me. Takes a couple seconds. There you go. And it opens a window for me with my entire solution. I open that. I'm going to go to Visual Studio. This takes a couple seconds to open Visual Studio. Of course, Visual Studio is not that fast. Come on. There we go. And solution. Come on with me. Here we go. So I have two different projects within my solution. One is the data model and one is the tests. And why did I do that? Because I want to separate those two. I want to have the option to just build my data model, to just get all the artifacts, all the objects from my database. And if I want to do any deployments with all the tests, I can just build my tests project and do all that together. And that makes it really easy for me and really efficient. So that's how you can create a SSDT project. Back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Sander. So, quick question then. What about unit tests? Because I know we can do that for other programming languages within Azure DevOps, and I'm sure you just mentioned them.
Yeah, so I separated my project to separate the unit tests. And with that, again, I am lazy as hell when it comes to repetitive tasks. So when I looked at some basic unit testing, I found that most of the basic tests that I did, like checking if an object is there, is my table there, is my store procedure present, does my table have the correct columns with the correct data types, does my view have the same kind of columns, do I have all the constraints in there? They were pretty repetitive and only the name changed or a couple columns, and I can iterate through those properties using PowerShell. So I made a PowerShell module called the tSQLt test generator, which is available on the PowerShell gallery. And this will take the current state of your database and generate those basic unit tests for you in a matter of a couple seconds. All those basic stuff based on the current state of your database. So that's the second script. I'm going to create a little database with a couple tables and a couple of store procedures, just some random ones. And now we're going to create the unit tests. So if we look at that code, this is the only thing you need. So you install the module from the PowerShell gallery, you point to an instance, you point to a database, and you say the destination where it should output these tests. In my case, in this demo, I'm going to output it right directly into my SSDT solution tests project and into the test basic folder. So let's run that. And it will look at all the objects. It will collect all the tables, all the store procedures, and all those little objects. And then it will generate for each and every one of them all these specific tests. And you're able to do different things. You can change the test class where it's in. You can set it to be a specific object, a specific schema, specific name. So you don't have to do this every single time for the entire set. That's also pretty important because you don't want to do this every single time because it takes the current state of your database, which means the tests will always be successful. So only do this for the entire database first time you do it, and then just either copy it from another test or generate it based on a specific table and specific kind of test. So in the meantime, it finished. And if I go back to Visual Studio, I can say add existing item, test basic. Exclude that one. And now I have all my objects in here. In the meantime, I can do an import, unit testing, object type. And I'm going to import all the objects. And from that moment on, I have my entire project in one solution with all the tests. So let's look at one of these unit tests. One really important one that people tend to forget when they start using database projects is to check if the collation is correct. Because if I deploy a DAC pack with a different collation, it's going to mean trouble for most of the projects. So it's going to test, set the expected value, then it's going to collect that, the actual value, and then it does an assert equals. So that means in tSQLt, these values have to be the same, otherwise it's going to fail. Other ones, test if a stored procedure exists. So it tests if the stored procedure table 1 create exists. And there's a function within tSQLt that says assert object exists. It's pretty important to know if your table is there if you do a deployment. One other one that may be interesting is columns. I want to know if the correct parameters are there for my stored procedure. Maybe somebody accidentally deleted a parameter, which can cause a lot of problems. And the same kind of thing happens for the tests for the tables and the views and the functions. Functions have parameters too. So that's how you can generate these tests. I think we did about 100 of them within a minute or two. So you can create these manually another way. So you can download the module, use it, and if you have any questions or you want to add anything to it, let me know. It's an open source project, so if you want to contribute to it, you're welcome. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Sander, and I will take the screen again. I do have a very important question for you in a minute as well. Once I've got the screen back. Oh, by the way, everybody, what Sander has just done and created, if you're wondering how it looks once you synchronize it from Visual Studio to Azure DevOps, it's actually here in Azure repos, and you can see the familiar structure from what Sander just showed you all there. So basically, yeah, his one-time create, you then sync it up with your repository and off you go to deliver it. Anyway, Sander, I've got a very interesting question for you relating to the pipeline. So I notice here, if I go to edit the pipeline that you were working on just now, that I can actually work with YAML here. However, I've seen previous demos which show a nice GUI to work with. Which one should we use?
Well, if I had the choice, I would just use YAML because the GUI, it's nice to explore things, but in the end, it's going to end up in YAML anyway. So, and it's not that hard to write the YAML because you just select one of the extensions on the right side, and Azure DevOps helps you to fill in all those fields. And if you say insert the extension into the task into the YAML file or in the pipeline YAML file, it's going to generate it for you. So it's not going to be that complicated. Just use the YAML version.
Well, I actually remember you telling me about that earlier. In fact, whilst you were explaining to everybody about tSQLt, I multitasked and experimented a little bit with the YAML pipeline you created, and nice. I extended it. And luckily, I'd already created something called an agent locally, which we will cover shortly, like I mentioned later on. So, yeah, basically what I did, Sander, which I will show you here, I actually went and extended. So you had to build in the unit testing stages, which you created just now with your script, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
What I actually did First of all, I created 3 other new environments to deploy SQL Server onto. So I installed 3 separate containers locally on my laptop, and and each of them have SQL Server installed. So one instance represents the integration environment, which is where you tend to do your integration tests. One to represent the staging environment, which is where you tend to do your user acceptance tests. And then finally, I had the final container representing a production environment. So as you can see from the green ticks there, they all worked fine. And in fact, if I go back in the Azure Data Studio and click on the right section, I'll show you how they look. So here is your integration database. And then here is your staging database. However, before I show you how it looks in the production instance, which represents your production environment, there's something else I want to show you as well. And by the way, everybody, in each of these stages, you can have multiple SQL Server instances. And this was all done by YAML. It wasn't done using the GUI at all, because like Sander said, YAML is the way forwards for working with your CI/CD pipelines. So, just for you, Sander, you will notice I actually synced it with a GitHub repository as well.
Nice.
Nice little bit of magic there for you. So, if I go to this GitHub repository, you will actually see all of your repository again there. And not only that, because I know that you've been experimenting a bit recently with GitHub Actions yourself, I actually thought I would create a GitHub action myself to deploy another SQL Server database to the production instance. So if we look at code here, and I will just quickly drill down and show you. Nothing really too over the top here. It's just a very simple GitHub action, which will allow you to deploy the very same DAT pack that I created earlier in the pipeline. So if I go back to here, this basically DAT pack here, I shared to a central location, and that location is then used for both deployments within Azure DevOps and GitHub as well. So you can do multiple deployments using multiple services using just that one DAT pack.
Nice.
So, yeah. So that was one thing I did there. And I remember the other day a conversation we had because of the version of the DAT pack file that we can actually use that same DAT pack to deploy to Azure. So I figured out a way to create another DAT pack specifically for Azure SQL databases. So there was a very special method involved with doing this. And in fact, Sander, I dubbed it the other day the Kevin method. Basically, what this method does, I can actually show you it in the pipeline code as well, if you bear with me. Let's break it down a bit and I will show you what I actually did. So, what I essentially done, Sander, first of all, I actually copied the files from your initial repository here. And this loads up. For your unit testing data database, I actually copied it to a special location, a staging area behind the scenes when the pipeline started running. So it's a folder basically, which is completely separate from this repository. It's behind the scenes, so nobody can touch it. And then once I copied the files into the staging area, I used a PowerShell command to actually replace that DSP file, which I mentioned earlier in the session. Then from there, with the renamed DSP file, I then built that pack again for a completely different version of SQL Server. And then I published that pack. And then once that stage was finished, that staging area that I created especially would be destroyed at the end of the process. So basically, if we go back to the pipeline again now, and I'll open up the repository in another window to highlight this. If I scroll down for you now, Sander, you will see we have 2 artifacts that have been created. However, the best thing about this method is that both of those DAT packs are based on this one database project. So
Nice.
there is no context switching of changing between 2 separate database projects. So this way you can update multiple versions of SQL Server and Azure SQL database with just one single change in one single database project in the repository. It's simple and very effective. And you can actually use this will be useful for us ongoing, because as well as using it for SQL Server 2017 and 2019, we can actually use it for our older SQL Server 2008 and 2012 installations that we need to migrate over to Azure SQL database as well. So during the migration process, we can actually keep some of those instances running in SQL 2008 and 2012 in the production environments, whilst we migrate over their counterparts in Dev and UAT. So yeah, that was something I did, especially to highlight the fact that, yeah, with a little bit of imagination, a lot of things are possible in Azure Pipelines as far as SQL Server deployments are concerned. So just to reiterate what I just said, from one project, one database project, which is stored in a Azure repo, you can create, a little bit of imagination, multiple DAT packs for multiple versions of SQL Server and Azure SQL database. So, in addition to that, obviously we showed just now that you could actually sync a GitHub repository, as shown here, to work with workflows. Of course, if you're going to use this and you want to have integration within Azure DevOps and a GitHub repository, you'll probably want to use branches as well for your branching strategy, because you don't want your workflow to run straight away all the time if your repository is updated. So to do that, obviously you would need to raise a pull request every time you want to merge the branches. And what you can do if you're working with the original pipeline being in Azure DevOps is then link your pull request in Azure DevOps to a product backlog item. So if you look here at this product backlog item, you can see there's a link here for the pull request in GitHub. So there is a lot of integration between Azure DevOps and GitHub if you want to use it.
Exactly.
So with that in mind, back over to you, Sander.
Yeah. So what I would like to show you, let's get the right stuff going, is when you use that template that I demonstrated earlier that you can download from my GitHub page, is that when you use it, you get 2 extra build artifacts with it. So what you can do, what it does, it generates an Azure DevOps pipeline for you. So what this entails is this entire pipeline will build your solution, and then it goes to the test stage, where it will spin up a SQL Server 2017 and a SQL Server 2019 SQL Server Linux container. And it will test all the tests that you entered in that test project and come back with results that you saw earlier, like Kevin extended quite a bit on. But recently, GitHub Actions was introduced, not recently, but it got introduced. So I made the same kind of thing with GitHub workflows. And it goes through the entire same process. It builds your project, which creates a deck pack, which is our artifact. That artifact gets uploaded to an artifact directory, and then in the next stage, it's going to be tested on SQL Server 2017 and SQL Server 2019. You can of course remove the 2019 or 2017 version. But these are the Docker containers available. And it was quite a bit of work in the beginning because I had to get used to the syntax between Azure Pipelines and GitHub workflows. But they are actually quite similar. There are just some little differences that we can put in that I want to show you. First of all, the variables within a GitHub workflow are just under the environment. With Azure Pipelines, these are just called variables. In Azure Pipelines, you have triggers, and with GitHub workflows, it's just on a certain with the on keyword and then push or pull request. And you don't have any stages in GitHub workflows. You do have those in pipelines, but you just call them, you have jobs and each job has a name, and then that's your thing to do. Another thing that's a little different is how it goes into all the different steps. So you don't have in particular, so you don't have stages within GitHub workflows. Those are just names. And you don't have jobs, you just have steps. So each step is one little different thing within my entire stage, or I call it a stage, because otherwise it's going to be really confusing. But these are mostly the same. I just have to, and I can show you the result because I have them both in here. So this is my test project for the unit testing. And if I open this YAML file, you can see that it builds my solution and it uploads the artifacts in the end, a specific directory. And then it tests everything for SQL Server. And the only difference in the end with Azure DevOps is that I cannot really bring back those artifacts back to Azure DevOps. So I just save them as an artifact in the GitHub workflows, and I can pull these artifacts in Azure DevOps if I wanted to start up another process. And these are the differences that for between the Azure Pipelines and the GitHub workflows.
I have a question. I've got my hand up.
Okay, go ahead.
My question is, GitHub Actions, when people start looking to use it, is maybe fairly daunting. And we've just shown everybody a very long piece of YAML. How does it look when you actually go to edit it in GitHub? Do they help you like you do in Azure DevOps?
They have IntelliSense. So if I go there, and if I do, oh, don't delete it.
Don't go there.
Where was it? Let's go to the workflows. And do an edit. Here we go.
Oh,
and
nice.
That looks pretty similar to Azure DevOps, because I still have on the right side all the extensions that I can in the marketplace that I can search through. But if I start typing and I say something like, if I do an enter, I immediately get some IntelliSense that I can put in. So it is pretty user-friendly. You just have to get used to writing YAML, because that is where CI/CD is going to go. And there are other build servers that don't do anything else than YAML, like Jenkins and TeamCity, for instance. So just start using YAML and get used to it. that's the best thing to do.
And also, as well as obviously the IntelliSense and the help you get with both the pipelines in Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions. There's also online as well, if you type into your favorite search engine, YAML references for both the CI/CD pipelines in Azure DevOps and in GitHub Actions as well.
Yeah. And of course, you can do, and we can do other stuff with SQL deployments. You can call PowerShell instead from your YAML to handle your deployments if you're dealing with a large number of servers.
How do we know if that worked?
Well, we could simply get PowerShell to output the XML in the same format as the JUnit test results, and then allow Azure DevOps to use the XML in a task, which publishes the results to view the results visually. Of course, we can put other feedback mechanisms in place for deployments as well.
We can do that?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Okay. Well, obviously you just showed us just now that you're still showing all of us in GitHub Actions, a whole list of tasks on the screen. And as I'm aware, if I go back and just take control of the screen a minute, because the question is very important. My question for you, Sander, if we go back into a pipeline, is as follows. So if I go back to edit this pipeline again, are we just limited to the tasks that we see on the right-hand side here is my question.
No, you can install loads of additional extensions from the marketplace. You can just hit search, and these are just regular results. Of course, because we are an enterprise company, we may have to request that we can install them instead of being able to install them straight away, which you usually do with whichever team manages the Azure DevOps for the whole enterprise.
I didn't realize enterprise-wide authorization was a thing.
Oh, yeah. But it does mean we can get help with those security and compliance issues you were talking about earlier. And I think you mentioned something before about third-party extensions that were not thoroughly tested enough.
Yeah, you're right there. There is sometimes a bit of concern about the amount of testing of some extensions, which is why some Microsoft provide the functionality for larger companies effectively to take control of which extensions they approve. And of course, it can potentially affect the performance of your whole organization as well, because as I'm sure some of you can imagine, if everybody in a company with hundreds or thousands of employees were allowed to just install whichever extensions they wanted, there could be a few issues. If you end up having to administer and manage literally hundreds of different extensions. Anyway, I've seen some that we can use Microsoft hosted agents, even within our own network on premises, to deal with SQL Server deployments, which are servers that Microsoft hosts in Azure to do a lot of the processing of build and release tasks, like building various artifacts and deploying them, like we were showing just now. However, it appears that because of our infrastructure, we'd have a lot of issues internally. For example, we'd have to raise a lot of firewall requests. So maybe we are better off building our own agents internally.
Maybe, but remember, a lot of us are developers and we don't want to build our own servers. So we'd have to figure out what software we need to install on those agents and maintain them. Oh, that looks interesting.
Yeah, so as I hope you can all see here, Microsoft actually provides guides on how to create images of their various agents in GitHub. Now, I understand that the title of this repository within GitHub may actually be a bit confusing. However, as we have just shown, GitHub Actions was actually made generally available earlier this year. And the agents that they can use are very similar to the ones that are used by Azure DevOps. In fact, they're pretty much exactly the same. So with this in mind, Microsoft have now released a guide on how to do it for both Azure DevOps agents and GitHub Actions runners as well. So essentially, they're exactly the same build. And in fact, the original repository was actually just called for Microsoft hosted CI/CD. But the one you actually want now is GitHub Actions Virtual Environments, which also covers the agents for GitHub Azure DevOps as well.
So, well, if we're going to do that, we might as well run the agent through the command line instead as a service.
How come?
Well, everybody knows that if you run stuff through the command line, you get more verbose results.
Okay, well, as you know, I tested it earlier. So let's see the results on the next slide.
And behold. Okay, not much there. Next part, test plans.
Moved on fairly quickly there.
Yeah, so of course we can do test plans once we've done the initial build and release before we release elsewhere.
Don't they all have to be automated though? Because that'll take a lot of effort for some items.
Not necessarily. Your test plan can have manual steps as well, which you can test yourself now.
Okay. Well, I will go and have a look in Azure DevOps and see. So if I look at a test plan. Oh yeah. So if I click on the, I can see there's a test plan here. So if I click on the execute to look to run it. So if I click on run for web application. Oh, this is nice. You've even very kindly put a nice picture in for me as well of how it should look like, Sander.
Your pretty little picture.
So I basically, if they pass, I click the tick, and if they fail, I click the cross, yeah?
Yep.
And if there is a problem, I can go to create a bug, and that will provide all the information in the bug as well about any potential issues to do with the results, which is quite nice. In addition to that, I can see I can take pictures, screenshots basically, whilst I'm doing this, or I can record. And I can even record with audio as well. Now, as you can see, I clicked on run for web application here. If I actually close this web window, you will see I actually have an option to run a desktop application. To do this, you need an application installed called Microsoft Test Runner. However, obviously, there's a couple of downsides to installing this. First of all, you have to make sure if you're installing it on your local machine. If it's a company machine, you have to have the right permissions to install it. In addition to this, Microsoft Test Runner also wants to open on the far left-hand side of your main monitor. So if you use multiple monitors, you will have to go into your display properties and change the main monitor you use if you want the test runner to be running on the same screen as your test plan. So be aware of that. Ooh. And also, sorry, I was just going to show people that there's a progress report as well. Anyway, sorry, Sander.
Go ahead.
On that note, back over to you.
So we'd better discuss artifacts here, which is where you can share various things like NuGet packages with other services or people. For example, if you create a NuGet package, you can share it within Azure Artifacts for others to use.
No, that's strange. I couldn't do anything with artifacts when I tested with the organization that I initially signed up for free.
Oh, That's because you sometimes have to go to your Visual Studio subscription benefits page to set them up.
So on that note, let's have a look and see how the artifacts look. So within Azure Artifacts, you would create what's known as a feed, and you can think of a feed a bit like a Linux repository. It's basically a remote storage where you would store packages on, and they can be of various types. Like Sander said, they could be NuGet or npm packages. And there's a couple of advantages of using these feeds in Azure DevOps. The first one is that you can actually use these feeds as a caching area. So if you work for a large company and you've got hundreds of users all downloading the same NuGet or npm packages, you can actually cache them in this feed instead, and they can just all go to this one central location. And that can save a lot of latency with your bandwidth. The other good thing about these feeds are that people within your organization can share their packages with people in other teams within Azure DevOps. So if they're all using the same project, they can access the feeds to download the packages on. Obviously, this is only mostly for developers that work with NuGet and npm packages, and doesn't always apply to people that work with SQL Server. So in addition to that, going back to what we were talking about just now about activating things in Visual Studio subscriptions, I just want to remind you all as well that you are all eligible to create your own Azure DevOps organization to test things on. There's actually a site you can go to provided by Microsoft, and you can register there, and then you can have your own test Azure DevOps organization. And if you have a Visual Studio subscription, it can also bring you additional benefits as well within your Azure DevOps organization.
And you want your own DevOps organization because you want to test out things without the fear of breaking your company's Azure DevOps organization. So make use of it.
Definitely something I recommend doing if you're looking to use Azure DevOps. Anyway, to be honest, Sander, there's other features I'm looking forward to the team using as well. So if we go back in our Azure DevOps, especially now, because if I'm going to be the product owner, there's the various dashboards that we can configure as well. And you can actually use these dashboards as well as part of your daily stand-up. So you can remind the team what the sprint goal is every single day. You can go through the metrics, including their velocity and the burn down chart as well during the stand-ups every day.
Cool. So don't forget the wiki.
Oh yeah, so there's a wiki as well if people want to use Markdown. And also there's the new Analytics Views feature, which is currently in preview at the moment. And so if any of you out there actually work with Power BI, what you can actually do is all of these analytics views here, you can actually use as data sets for Power BI. So you can actually generate powerful dashboards. And in fact, I've used analytics views myself to replicate a sprint review dashboard, which I can assure you is very good and is very dynamic. In addition to all of this as well, Sander, I know obviously you guys in the developer team, you prefer to work with code instead of dealing with these portals. So there is actually an Azure CLI extension, which is quite useful. So you can test if you've already got it installed or not. You can actually just simply run this command again and it will update your extension for you. And just like anything else in Azure CLI, basically, you can just run the commands from here. So for example, just looking at the help for the Azure Pipelines command, you can see there's a whole list of various things you can do from the command line instead of working from the portal. As you can probably see here in the square brackets, a lot of these are currently in preview. They're still being developed. This extension is still fairly new. However, it can be quite useful. And you can use it in various services within Azure DevOps. You can use it for the boards, you can use it for the pipelines and all sorts. And just to give you an example of it working, you can generate a list of your pipelines that are currently in place in your project. And as you can all see here, the results are actually in a JSON format. And I happen to know that one of the hosts for this user group is a big fan of JSON.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's really good CLI. And like I said, a lot of it is still in preview at the moment, but Sander, I think our developers may like using this instead of the portal.
Indeed. So where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest we start by getting both teams together and explain to them what we're trying to achieve.
Anyway, that's all we've got time for today. And I wonder if there are any questions.
I will first press stop recording and then we can continue with that.